Hi, my name's Russ Scammell. I recognize some of you from the earlier talk. We're going to talk about building organic 2D worlds with SpriteShape. Right? So we spoke about this a little bit in the keynote, and in the earlier session, I showed you some stuff that we can do with it. We're going to cover some of the same ground so that people who are only in this talk will also see that. And then we're going to dig in a little bit on some of the details, and we're going to look at some scripting at the end because SpriteShape is scriptable. So I'd like to know who I'm speaking to, who's in the audience. So who are the coders in the room? Any coders? Cool. Any artists? Okay, and I have to ask it this way because I'm going to get some other hands now. Any artists that call themselves designers? Oh, okay, slightly fewer. Okay, cool. And everyone else, I assume, producers, executive producers, that kind of thing? No? Cool. Okay, so SpriteShape is our solution for organic world building, right? So let's start there. So 2D world building in Unity has typically been, you bring in a sprite, you custom author a sprite, and you bring that in. Or you do 9 slicing with your sprite. So you prepare your sprites by cutting them into these 9 parts and then kind of do some cool tiling tricks there. Or you use tile map. So if you're doing grid-based worlds, tile map is a really good solution. You can have rectangular grids, or you can work with now hexagonal grids, and in 2018.3, isometric grids. But what if you want to make something a little bit more organic, right? A little bit wiggly, slightly different shapes. So SpriteShape is designed to address this, right? This kind of outcome. So it's for shape-based layouts. The idea here is that you have a spline, and then we tile a sprite along that spline, and then we fill a closed spline with a tiled texture. Cool? So these are both examples of things, the kind of shapes, the kind of forms that you can get with SpriteShape. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit into the different parts of SpriteShape, and then we'll spend a lot of time in demos kind of looking at how SpriteShape is used and what the different options are and what you can play with. So at the heart of it is this idea of the SpriteShape profile, right, where you define essentially a set of angle ranges. And based on those angle ranges, we will know kind of what sprite to switch to, right? Which sprite should we render? And when we talk about angle ranges, what angle are we talking about? It's the normal that comes out of the spline, right? So if you have a circular spline and you have normals facing up, and you've got an angle range for all angles kind of facing up, we will be rendering that sprite within that range. So we'll set one up in a minute so you can see how it works. There's also a lot of stuff in there where we can control kind of things like UVs and where we get the UVs from. How do we want to control offsets? Do we have variants for our sprites? What about corners? How do we define those, right? All of that goes into your SpriteShape profile. So it's a configuration step, right, for your sprite shapes. So once you have a sprite shape in the scene, what do we do, right? So we need a SpriteShape renderer. That's going to be in charge of making sure that that sprite shape is there, is displayed, and that takes in all the normal stuff you'd expect from a renderer. You've got sorting layer, ordering layer, so you can kind of control how that's going to sort with all the other renderers in your scene. And then you have a SpriteShape controller, and this is for access to all of the kind of the runtime editable stuff that you'd have in the scene, right? So your control points, what's the detail of the generated mesh? Is this open-ended or not? These kind of things. So we're going to take a look at how all of that works. And we're going to see how it affects the collider as well, right? So SpriteShape is designed so that you can build these levels, but also make sure that they are pieces of gameplay, right, that you can interact with. So you need it to work with your collision system. Cool. So these are the demos that we're going to go through. Right, we're going to look at the basics again. Just from the beginning, what is the SpriteShape? How do we set it up? We're going to look at the corner case. specifically for corners. And then we're going to look at building a platformer to see how you'd put together the parts that you need to build a platformer, as well as a couple of special cases for sprite shapes. And then we have 2 or 3 examples of scripting to see what you can do with SpriteShape. Okay. So let's start with an empty scene. So how do I build a sprite shape, right? So the first thing I want to do is I want to make a sprite shape profile. So it's something that looks like this. I'll zoom in a bit here so we can see all of this together. And I'll walk you through step by step. So first thing you want to do is create sprite shape profile. Let's make an empty one. Okay, so we can see over here, I'll zoom out a little bit. I think we're good, yeah. So we can see over here that the sprite shape profile has a bunch of settings, right? And we're going to look at each of these in detail, except probably the bevel stuff. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is you want to define, you want to give your sprite shape a name, probably. So this is the Unity-ANZSEA sprite shape. Cool. Okay, so we want to give it a fill, right? So the first thing you can do is that you can fill this sprite shape. We'll see what that means in a minute. But for now, we'll see that it takes a texture 2D. Okay, so let's take a dark gray fill here. All right. Next up, so you can set up a couple of things here, pixel per unit and all that. We'll see how that affects things. But let's do a simple setup. The biggest piece of UI you'll see here is this angle range piece, right? And this is where you build that relationship between angle ranges and the sprites that they're going to display. So I'm going to click in here to create a new range, right? And then you can kind of set it up nice and organically like that. And then I'm going to click down here and make another range and set it up like so. And then you can see that as I move this dial around, it's kind of changing the direction that this surface is pointing in, right? So imagine that this is the top of the surface and it's pointing in that direction. And what I want to do is I want to define the sprite to display for everything that's pointing within this angle range, right? Any segment that finds itself in that range. And I do that by adding a sprite here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a sprite. And then I'm going to fill it with grass outline, like so. Cool. Now we need one more for this angle range down here. So same thing. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to drag in the orange outline. So now we can see anywhere that we're going to aim up, we're going to get this green grass top. And if we face down, we're going to get an orange kind of thing, right? And to get this to render in the scene, we just need to drag it in there, like so. Okay, and by default, you get this kind of squarey thing. Okay, so let's go back to the sprite shape profile. So I want to show you what happens if you change pixel per unit on your texture. This is for controlling kind of how, can you see the scale of that fill? Right, that changes with your pixel per unit, so you can have that change. World space UV, we're going to see in a minute. Right now, we're working with local space, so it's bound to that object. If I turned on world space UV and then move this object around, let me zoom out now. You can see that the UVs are, of course, world space. Right? You can see it's like we have a portal into that texture. Maybe useful for a special effect. Okay, and then back to the sprite shape again. Okay, so we've set all this up. I want to go back to my 100 pixels per unit. That's great. Let's look at the sprite shape controller in scene. So when we drag this into the scene, this is what was created, right? We've got a game object with a sprite shape renderer on it. We can change the color tint on that if you want. You can make this interact with masks. So this works with all the masks that you've seen in 2D. And of course, sorting layers, so you can sort it with other renderers. And this is where a lot of the magic happens. Sprite Shape Controller gives you access to spline editing tools, right? So you can select each of these individually, and when you select that, you get a whole bunch of other things that show up here that control height, cutoff, sprite index, whether or not there's a corner there, things like that. And of course, in the scene, you have this kind of organic control over how you want to move things around, right? So we can move things like this. We can change the control point type. In this case, I'm using a shortcut key M, or I can come over here and go through the other types. You can do a broken shape if you want, so you can do that kind of stuff, right? In an upcoming update to this, we're going to add continuous but non-mirrored, because that's a very useful kind of control that you want. Currently, all the continuous control points are mirrored, which can be a limitation. But as you can see, we can very quickly come in here and just kind of, there we go, getting kind of creative with this stuff, and we can build a level out quite easily, right? Hey, awesome. So while you're doing all of this, you're probably already thinking about how your character's going to walk around on this level. You know, how's he going to collide with this surface? You know, you want to make sure that does exactly what you expect. So how do we set this up so that we can get something to collide with it, right? So it works with polygon colliders. So what I'm going to do here is add a component, polygon collider 2D. And then I don't think I want that one. I want to go to the collider section. So this shows up when you add a collider. And you can turn on update collider. Okay. So now that you've got update collider on, when you move your sprite shape around, we dynamically adjust that collider for you. So you've got something that's going to fit with the gameplay that you've designed. This may be too low res for you, so you can switch it to medium quality or high quality and really get in there and get a nice high res collider that neatly fits what you're trying to build. Now let's say that your visuals don't perfectly match the edge of this shape, right? Maybe you've got tufts of grass that extend a little bit beyond the shape, and you want to kind of take that into account when you're building stuff. So when you look at the collider, there is an offset option here. So you can actually push the collider out or in, right? This can be very useful if you're trying to adjust for, again, we're building organic levels, so there's going to be softness and furriness, right, to that edge. Cool. Okay, let's look at corners, right? So let's step away from the basics. We know how to set one up. We know how to make it work with collision. How would we handle something like this, right? So typically, we would try to construct something like this using tiles, right? We would build tiles, and then we would lay them out on a grid, which is a good way to start. But if you wanted to still take advantage of the fact that you have a spline, right, and you can control kind of where those corner points go, and you still want straight edges, but maybe you don't want them axis aligned. Maybe you want them to be a little bit more exciting. Then you can go in here and edit the spline, and you can see, hey, I can still do this, right? So this is a sprite shape with corners, right? So there's a tolerance beyond which the corners kick in, right? And you can really do these kind of fun, zany-looking kind of things, right? So you can see the corners have a tolerance. They'll only come in beyond a certain point, right? Okay, so how do we do this? So let's look at the sprite shape profile. So it's same kind of thing, right? Here we've got a fill. In this case, we've got 4 angle ranges because we want to define top, bottom, left, and right. And then down here, you can see we've got corners, right? So we've defined specific sprites for each of those corners. So we've got inner, outer, top, right, bottom left, bottom right, and then all the 8 kind of pieces that you would need to bring this together. And then you assign each of those, and then there you go, you have corners. So let's say you have assigned some corners to your sprite shape and you want to disable them for certain control points. So if we go back to the sprite shape controller, and I don't want a corner there, we can look over here and we can see there is a corner control. So it can be automatic, which means it will show up when the angle is right, or we can just turn it off, right? So we have no corner. So this gives you some control over when to display these kind of things based on the kind of game that you're building. Excellent. Okay, so for the next case, I want to look at a slightly more involved example where we're looking at a platformer, and we want to think about reuse of parts. We also want to think about variation, right? Variation on a theme. Okay, so how do we do this? Let's go to this level. Okay. So if we look at this this setup here, so this is a sprite shape which has been corrected. So let me undo some of the stuff, and then we'll see how it works. So we want to build a platformer, and we want to build it from kind of sprites, reusable parts. And we want to have some control over how things get rendered, okay? So in this case, I've got these really hard edges here, and I've got rocks for some of the angle ranges that are rendering currently on top of the grass. Doesn't look too bad here, but I want to be in control of this. I want the grass to render on top of the rocks. So how do I do this? How do I get some control back? So the first thing I want to do is I want to soften those edges. And in order to understand how that works, we're going to click on the grass and rocks profile, find the sprite that's being used for that, and take a look at it in the sprite editor. And we'll notice that the grass sprite has actually been sliced here and here, right? This is by setting a left and right border. So this means that that central part can tile, right? We've painted it so that it can tile. And then those end pieces are like caps that we can put on the end of the sprite shape. Okay, so the way to get it to use those kind of things is to come into the sprite shape profile and make sure that we've got use sprite borders turned on, right? That's this setting here, use sprite borders. So if we look at that sprite over here, we can see that's doing what we want it to do now. We've got those nice soft edges, right? We still have the rocks kind of cutting into the grass here, and again, I don't mind the style, but I just want control, right? I want the grass to be on top, so what do? So if we look over here at the angle ranges, we can see that for each angle range, there's actually a start angle and an end angle, and also an order, right? Which means that you can set the rendering order for each of these. So we want the rocks to render first, and then on top of that, we want the grass. So we want to set grass rendering order to 1. And because the grass texture here has this nice kind of alpha shadow underneath it, that's part of the texture, it kind of looks like it's dropping a shadow over the rocks. So that's exactly what I wanted. And there we go. Okay. What about reusable parts? What if we are trying to build a platformer and we want to connect different parts together? Then what do? So here's 2 platforms. Okay, and I want to have these platforms connect to each other seamlessly, right? So the first problem, of course, is that they're not in the right place. So I need to do a little bit of editing to the spline to make sure they are the right size. And to make that process easier, you can come into the edit spline and you can turn on snapping, which is right here. So with snapping turned on, I can bring this over here and snap it perfectly against the other vertex, like that, and that's a lot better. Okay. And if I undo that, sorry, if I deselect that, we can see we have platforms that connect seamlessly. So how did we get this seamless connection here between the 2 sprite shapes? We've already seen this, but let's revisit it briefly. We're using world space UVs, right? So again, if I turn those off, you can see now there's a seam right? Because this is following its own local space, and that's following its own local space. And if we turn it back on, that's just going to be seamless. So this is really cool if you want to connect a bunch of them together. Okay. Cool. Now, what if we want to break up how homogeneous this grass looks? It's just one grass strip, right? It's just green. There's nothing exciting going on. Of course, you could create your own sprites. You could paste them on top of that. You could kind of fill it up with boulders or things. But if they're minor variations and you just want to kind of add a little bit of you want it to look a little bit different, like maybe the grass is dry or it has some other details in it, we can look at the sprite variance, which is something that you can do for each angle range. So if you look at these angle ranges, for each defined angle range, you have a list of sprites. And in this case, we've been using grass top. We could have used grass with small rocks or grass with flowers, right, to make it a bit more interesting. And because those are already in the profile, I can actually come in here and set them up. So I'll just come in here to this section, go in there, maybe this one here, and then go into the sprite index and change that value, right? So sprite index on the sprite controller for the selected control point, change it to 1. And then I have some rocks. Or I come over here, and I do the same thing. And I change that to 2. And I have some flowers. And you can see it is a completely different sprite because, as you can tell, the sprite border's changed here on the edge, right? So you can play around with the different ways that sprite variations can add to your game. Cool. So we've had sprite variations. We can work with reusable platforms. Okay, so far we've been using sprite shapes that are complete, right? They're completely closed, they have an edge, and they have a fill. Now, what if we only wanted to use an edge, right? We didn't want to use the fill at all. We can do that. So let's look at this example. Okay, so how about this one? Right, here's a slightly warped and fantastical looking sprite shape, right? Like something out of a children's storybook. And the way we do this, if we look at the sprite shape controller, is we make it open-ended, right? And because we really don't need to waste the texture, this does not have a fill. So if we look at the grass strip sprite shape profile, it's just one strip like that all the way around. It's a single angle range all the way around, and there is no fill texture. Okay, so that's how you would do that. Excuse me. Okay, also you may have noticed that this thing kind of tapers off to the end. And we saw this control earlier, but we just glossed over it. You can come in here, and for each of these parts, you can change the height, right? So you can do some really cool organic shapes that change in their kind of their cross section, right? In their height per control point. Cool. And then finally, maybe you don't want to use the edge, right? Maybe you just want to use the fill. So you could end up using a sprite shape profile that looks like this, right? And in this case, we have a tree fill texture, which is really small, and it just takes up the fill, and there's no angle ranges, right? So we're not using the edge at all. And we've got a few of those with slightly different hues. And if we turn them on in the scene and we look at the controllers that are using those, they're just tree outlines, right? So we fill up all of those, keep going all the way through, and we have this kind of silhouette forest, right, fading into the fog in the back. So again, if we look at this whole scene, we look at how it's all come together. Let's turn off that stats window. And you can see that we've got all these different variations, all these different rendering outcomes, and they've come from sprite shapes, right? So it's very flexible. A very versatile system for building kind of different kind of shapes, different kind of levels, different styles, and you can even work with corners, as we saw earlier. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about scripting in SpriteShape. What can you do? What can you get access to? I'm not going to dig too deep, but I'm basically going to talk about some of the more important things that you want to do. So typically you'll want to get into the spline. That's what you want to access. So getting access to Unity-Engine.2D.spline is as simple as getting a reference to the SpriteShape controller's spline. So we'll look at an example of what we could do with that. Let's come over here. Okay, so these really cool assets are by Zoink Games. This is from a project called Flipping Death. If you haven't played that game, you should. It's really awesome. It's out on the Nintendo Switch. Let's take a look, right? So here we've got a level, right, built out of SpriteShape. This is just an ordinary sprite, right, and then a bunch of other ordinary sprites. Let's just hit play on that because it looks pretty cool, right? So what if you wanted to do something with that level, right, where you want to move stuff around, you want to change the shape of the sprite shape, but you've got these sprites that you've kind of carefully authored on top of it, that you've placed, you know, nicely, you've rested them on top of the sprite shape, and you want them to move accordingly. Okay, so what we've got here is, for each of these sprites, we've got a place at sprite shape point. It's just a script, yeah? And if we take a look at this script in Visual Studio, we can see what we're doing. Right, so we won't spend too much time here, but basically what we are doing is we're getting access to this, right, which is the SpriteShape controller spline. And once you have control of that, you can do all sorts of stuff, right? So here we're getting left tangent, we're getting right tangent, we've got the angle between them, and then we use that to kind of update the angle of the sprite. So a lot of this stuff will be included in the samples pack for SpriteShape, so there's no need to like take pictures of the code now. But it's all kind of set up to influence that spline. Okay, so back in Unity, what does this actually do? Right, all of this code that we were looking at so briefly. So if we look at edit spline and we come here and we get that one, right, we can see that this house, this one here, has been attached to index 7 on this, right? So if we get hold of the sprite, go here, click on that, we can come in there and we can move that house around, right? So that way it maintains its normal position on the sprite shape, and yet the sprite shape can deform as expected underneath. Right, you can move that up and down, that'll just sit nicely there. I mean, it's not going to look good for all cases, but it's a good way of kind of tweaking things after the fact. Or maybe you're doing some procedural generation and you want to place things on these points. Cool. Okay, so that's the first example. Second example, a little bit more involved. Let's dig into that. Where are we? Let's look at points to curves. Okay, so what we've got here is a little bit of fun that we were trying to do with SpriteShape. This is based on the C# implementation of Philip J. Schneider's least squares method for fitting Bezier curves to input data points. So what am I talking about? We're going to poll the mouse position, right? And based on where the mouse goes on the screen, we're going to collect a bunch of points. And once we have those points, we're going to reduce them. And then once we've reduced them, we're going to find a curve that best fits that. And then we're going to take that curve and feed it into SpriteShape. Cool. So after all of that, what do we actually get? So the way we've implemented this, so I'll give you a link to the GitHub for this. So this is Burning Mime's implementation. So if we look over here, we can see there's a bunch of scripts for doing all of this. And then finally, in one of those scripts, we feed into the spline. And I just want to show you the code for this, because there is one step that's important. So this is the SpriteShape brush editor where we actually do that. So we make a bunch of changes through here, we add the points, we set it all up, we feed that into the spline, and then finally, when you're done, you bake the collider, right? So we can update the collider as well when we're doing this, so it's not just a visual step. And the reason I'm drawing your attention to this is updating a collider like this, especially if you're doing it at runtime, is something you want to be a bit careful with. It's not so bad, but it can kind of slow down. It can slow things down if you're doing it in a high frequency kind of function. Cool. So what do we get? So we can come in here and we can look at this editor. I'm going to click on Paint here, and we've got a little simple Paint GUI that we set up in the editor. And I can just do something like this, and we can build all these kind of things. So the level has it as well, so if I want to build my own level, I can do that. Let's build a very quick level. Whee. Okay, I think we're doing good. Let's turn on some of the other rocks and set those up as well. Okay, and maybe this one, and then maybe I'll repaint that first one because a bit of the outline didn't turn out as I expected. Okay, and then we can just hit play. Okay, so there you go. We drew a whole bunch of physics objects quite nicely. We fed them into SpriteShape. SpriteShape has a collider, so it can use them. We baked that at edit time, and so you can literally brush your levels into existence, right, by doing these kind of workflows with SpriteShape. Awesome. Okay, so back to the slides for a little bit more. This is the external resource if you want to check it out. I know I had a lot of fun taking a look at this. And it was it was quite simple, maybe half an hour, 1 hour to kind of figure out how to get it to feed into SpriteShape. We'll be putting this on our samples as well, so you can see how we connected to this stuff. Has everyone got that? If you want to try it out, if you have not used SpriteShape, please check out get the latest beta and then install it from the package manager. Make sure you've got preview packages turned on, because that'll make sure that you can see all of the 2D packages, which, because of alphabetical ordering, are right at the top, so very hard to miss. What you can do, I always like to end my talks with a little bit of a call to action to our users, because we are building stuff for you. And try them out, right? Try out the packages, let us know what you think, what works, what doesn't work. Come in the forums, have a nice chat with us. Tell us what's missing, what else we need to add. Very often we'll reach out to you personally because we want to understand more. And of course, keep making all those awesome 2D experiences that you're already making in Unity. Thank you.